in the JFI 15-year anniversary webinar series entitled The Big Picture, What Does the Election Mean for Immigration Policy? We're very thankful for you to join us here today. We have a great lineup of speakers who are going to talk about the recent election and the impact that this has on our work for protecting immigrants and refugees. First, I did want to do a little bit of housekeeping as we get started. With me always is Tony Cubay, your national coordinator. These slides will be available on our website tomorrow. They will also be available in the weekend review, and we will have the recording of this webinar up as well on the website tomorrow. There may be media on this call. Please, identify yourself. If you want to follow up and speak to one of the speakers, please let Mark Priceman, mpriceman at USCCB, know, and he can connect you to the speakers for any sort of media article follow-up if there's any interest. And so with that, I want to get started to introduce our speakers today. And again, start to dig into what we can expect to see. So Tony, if you could go back, thanks. So the speakers, I'm Ashley Feasley, who you all know. I will be working with Tony kind of to give an introduction and moderating this last of our anniversary series. And then we have three speakers who will be kind of unpacking some of the election results and what we can expect to see. Jacinta Ma works at the National Immigration Forum. They are a great partner for us in a number of national initiatives they do. They led the All of Us initiative that many of you participated in at the parish and diocesan level. Teresa Cardinal Brown works at the Bipartisan Policy Center. They are another partner of ours here. You may have seen Teresa. She does a lot of updates on the state legislative initiatives that I know some of the state Catholic conference directors have read, and other things particularly around some of reforming our immigration system. And then lastly, Carlos Guevara from Unidos US. They are also a partner of ours. Many of the bishops have personal relationships with the Unidos leadership, and many of you also have affiliate relationships at the diocesan and parish level with the Unidos throughout the country. And so I'm very, very thankful to have all three of these individual speakers on the phone today and in our webinar. We will be doing basically them talking for the first part of the hour, and then as type into the chat box your questions, Tony will then take them up at the end of the session. If there are things that we miss, we are happy to follow up with you as things move forward. And like I said, the resources are always available on the Justice for Immigrants website. So with that, I'm going to get started. So again, I'm Ashley Feasley, who many of you know. We will be continuing the work just as we have been the last 15 years for Justice for Immigrants. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about kind of what we can expect just on a general level, kind of as to what happened. We know at this point in time that President-elect Biden has received enough votes to move forward in the Electoral College. The states themselves have not certified that result, but there is consensus by many indicators of that effort, and we do expect that to be the final result sooner rather than later. There are efforts, I think, to count all the votes, which is certainly a right, but we are moving forward under the leadership of Archbishop Gomez, who congratulated President-elect Biden, and we are moving forward to work with the Biden administration. It goes without saying, with the election of Vice President Biden and now President-elect Biden, that we will be seeing a much more favorable administrative climate towards immigrants and refugees than we have seen under the Trump administration. while that is, I think, a welcome relief for those of us who are working directly with impacted communities or our immigrant and refugee leaders in our church, I do want to say that many things will not be immediately reinstated or go back to normal. Our experts are going to talk a little bit in more detail about that, but an example I know many of you care about is the asylum protections we've talked about, and many dioceses along the border have seen firsthand kind of some of what's been happening there with people waiting because of the migrant protection protocols. They are forced to wait in Mexico. We do not expect things to immediately go back to normal or even improve from where they were, at the end of 2016. So I ask you to have patience and listen to our experts on some of the things that they have to say about that here today. The way that it looks right now, even though there's a number of House races that are still kind of being figured out, and we have 2 Senate races that will have a runoff vote out of the state of Georgia on the 5th of January, is that we are headed towards divided government. What do I mean by that? Well, divided government would mean we have a Democrat in the White House, and then we also likely have, the Senate under the control of the Republicans. There is a chance that the Senate could be held by the Democrats if the Democrats win both of the seats in the January 5th runoff, but, we don't know, and that is, less than likely, and so we certainly may be facing this divided government. I think that's important. I think our speakers will talk about it. And then the last bullet, I think, is something that we as a Catholic community have been very engaged on for many years, even prior to the creation of the Coalition of Justice for Immigrants. But the idea and the hope of advancing meaningful legislative reform that contains, a reform of our immigration system, provides large-scale legalization, and kind of looks towards an eye of modernizing a system that really is in need of that legislative fix. That I think remains up in the air. I'm looking forward to hearing from some of our experts, and we, of course, will unpack more of this on our national call next week. But I did just want to set the table for our speakers to begin talking. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jacinta to start talking about what we can actually hopefully see from a Biden administration and how it impacts us in our work with immigrants and refugees.
Thanks so much for inviting me to join this webinar, Ashley. And it's really just great to be here with Teresa and Carlos, and thanks to everybody for listening. The Trump administration has taken over 400 administrative actions on immigration, and at least 50 of those occurred just during March through September. And we know that there may even be more still to come. At the end of the Bush presidency and the Obama presidency, between the time of the election and a new administration coming in, there were over 100 regulations that were put in place. I don't expect those to be all immigration, but it certainly means that there will be more. And so the question that I've been getting frequently really is just how much of this will be undone in a Biden administration? And this is a question that we've thought a lot about. We at the National Immigration Forum, we're a nonpartisan advocacy organization that advocates for the value of immigrants and immigration to the nation. And we build trusted relationships to create a shared vision for immigration in America. And by working with those in the center right, as well as those on the left, we really hope to lead a conversation on the value of immigration for a strong, prosperous, and vibrant America. And as Ashley said, we won't know until January whether it will be Republicans or Democrats controlling the Senate. I'm giving my remarks and my thoughts really just based on the idea of a Biden administration dealing with a Republican-controlled Senate. And so I've been asked to focus on a few key issues that we at the Forum are following really closely. This is the DACA, TPS, refugee resettlement, and the border wall. But I know we'll have a Q&A session afterwards, and I'm happy to address other issues during that time. A number of news reports, and President-elect Biden himself has talked about, what he wants to do fairly quickly on immigration. And Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, is one of those things. DACA, as you may remember, it was put in place by the Obama administration in 2012, and it provides temporary protection from deportation and work authorization for people who were brought to the U.S. as children. DACA was restricted to those who had been in the U.S. since 2007, had come to the U.S. before age 16, and were under 31 as of June 15, 21. And you had to be at least 15 to be eligible to apply. So this number of people was, it's an estimated 1.3 million who are eligible for DACA. At the beginning of his presidency, President Trump ended DACA, and he put in place procedures to wind it down. That got stopped by the courts while the litigation proceeded, but at that point, no new people could apply for DACA, and only those who had it could renew it. And at that point, we had about over 800,000 people who had DACA. So we fast forward through the administration and the litigation, and we know that in June, the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court found that the Trump administration improperly ended DACA and required DHS to revert back to the original policy implementing DACA. But before that happened, the Trump administration reviewed the memo and they changed DACA. So they no longer are allowing new people to apply, and they're allowing renewals, but they reduced the temporary protections from 2 years to 1 year. So now there are only about 645,000 people who are DACA recipients. So what do we expect to happen with them? I'm expecting the Biden administration on day one to restore DACA. And that would mean that the approximately 61,000 children who hadn't reached 15 by the time that the Trump administration ended DACA, they could now be eligible to apply for DACA. And I think that the Biden administration will also restore DACA to the point where they would give at least 2 years of protection. Other things I could see them doing through executive action is possibly even expanding, who's eligible. So it wouldn't just be those who were in the country since 2007, but it could be expanded so that there would be additional people who would be eligible for DACA. And again, these are people who brought who came to the United States at a young age. President-elect Biden has also pledged to address these, to introduce legislation that would address the situation of the undocumented on day one, and obviously that would include Dreamers. It's a little unclear to me whether that is going to be actually a realistic bill or whether it's more of a messaging or a vision bill that he's able to get introduced, and that basically checks the box on a campaign promise. I think that he doesn't have a lot of time to be able to go in and negotiate with Republicans to try to introduce a bill that could actually pass, if he has to do this by day one. So to me, I think the most likely scenario is that it is mostly a very, a bill that is, a visionary bill in the sense of like, this is what he would ideally like. I do think that, if we're dealing with a Republican controlled Senate, legislation to address Dreamers is probably the population that just has the most amount of bipartisan support to get a legislative bill passed to address them. But even given just how much support, bipartisan support, Dreamers have, it's still going to be very difficult with a Republican-controlled Senate that's led by Senator McConnell to get any legislation passed. If history holds true, he has made it difficult to bring up legislation on immigration issues, and in the past, he's always looked for legislation that could get at least a majority of his caucus, if not more. And so the idea had always been to try to get a bill that Republicans support and to peel off a few Democrats. And I just think that that's a very difficult situation because you have a House that's controlled by Democrats. They would not support such a bill. And I think a bill that gets primarily Republican support just won't be able to get enough support from Democrats to pass. So I think it's really challenging. And I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen. We will have to see. I mean, I'm always hopeful that something could change, but again, I won't be too surprised if it's if it doesn't happen. But as the president-elect has said, he wants to work across the aisle. So maybe this will usher in a new era where there will be more bipartisan discussion and cooperation. Next slide, please. Another issue is temporary protected status, or TPS, and this is the program that allows individuals from designated countries who can't handle the return of their foreign nationals due to natural disasters like hurricanes or earthquakes, even health epidemics, or civil war, armed conflicts. So it allows them to stay here in the United States and to work. And so currently 400,000 people in our country have TPS, and many of these folks have been in the country for decades, and they have U.S. citizen family members. So President Trump ended TPS for most of these countries and all of these people, and that was, generally that's been stalled by litigation. But right now, one of the most recent court cases coming out of the Ninth Circuit ruled that TPS could be ended for El Salvador, Honduras, Haiti, and Sudan. And so that means over 300,000 individuals are facing the possibility of deportation after a wind-down period, which could happen as early as March of next year. I expect that the Biden administration will quickly take action to protect TPS recipients through some sort of administrative action. I don't know exactly how they would do it. I think there are a number of options that they have. I mean, I think they could easily extend the wind-down period so that it's, instead of 6 months, it could be, 2 years. They could try to, redesignate countries for TPS through a process through DHS, but I think that would take a little bit more time because they'd have to analyze whether the countries are unable to handle the return of their citizens. It's unclear whether the coronavirus has an impact on that. If a country has high levels of coronavirus, does that mean that they can't handle the return of their citizens? So these are all questions I think somebody would have to try to answer and figure out, and they're not that easy to answer like in a day, so that would take some time. The other thing that they could do is they could use a process called deferred enforced departure, where the president makes a determination under his power to conduct foreign relations that he should let these people stay. So there are a number of different things, but they will, they'll take a little bit of time. So while I expect things will happen, I think it will take a little bit of time. And in terms of legislation to address the situation of these folks, they've been here for many, many years, really contributing to the United States in so many ways. So it seems like we really want to try to provide a more permanent situation for them. Legislative efforts so far haven't been that successful. And while a lot of Democrats have really supported providing a permanent solution for TPS recipients, the support from Republicans has been not as robust. Some Republicans have expressed support for addressing the situation of TPS recipients, but they've been reluctant because they're really concerned about how the program has allowed people to, it's called temporary protected status, but it's allowed people to stay in the country for many, many years, and so they are looking for ways to reform the program so that we don't find ourselves in the same situation in the future. So I think, in terms of trying to get a legislative solution, if we're dealing with a Republican-controlled Senate, there will have to be a lot of efforts to try to figure out what is a solution for addressing the program in the future. And to date, there just hasn't been a lot of discussion about, what that would look like and what the compromise could be on that. So again, there's always possibility, but it will definitely require negotiation. It will require willingness to work together, and we haven't really seen that so far, and it remains to be seen whether under a Biden administration we'll find that the Democrats and Republicans in Congress will cooperate with each other more. Next slide, please. And then in terms of refugee resettlement, as this slide shows, the U.S. has been a welcoming nation for refugees and a global leader, admitting on average since 1980 about 95,000 refugees each year until we get to the Trump administration. So in his first year in office, the president reduced the refugee ceiling from 95,000 to 50,000 and reduced it further, each year. And then for this most recent year, fiscal year 2021, set the ceiling at 15,000, which is a historic low. Next slide, please. And President Biden-elect has committed to increasing refugee levels to 125,000. Now, I don't think he could increase the refugee ceiling on day one, but I do think that it would happen within the first 100 days. There is precedent to change the previous presidential determination, just as President Trump did. But one additional thing that would need to be changed is returning from a category approach to refugees to a regional approach, which we had before. So currently, as you can see in this slide, the Trump administration has these categories of, types of refugees that are allowed to be resettled. And so if you wanted to go back to the regional approach, you'd have to figure out like how many from each region should be able to resettle, all of those kinds of things. So again, something that could be done, but will take some time. There is some question about whether it's legal to increase the refugee ceiling after it's been set. But even if they decide that that's not the way to go, there are other provisions in the INA that would allow the president-elect to approve of additional refugees after consultation with Congress, if it's in the national interest. So there are a number of ways that he can increase refugees, but again, these are things that just, they're procedural, they take time. And I think the other difficulty, which I'm sure a lot of you are really familiar with, is that it's going to be difficult to immediately ramp up refugee resettlement because of the, how the infrastructure has been diminished over the last few years. There's just, there wasn't as much funding, and so we would really need to be able to increase the amount of funding for refugee resettlement and increase capacity of people on the ground to help with the refugee resettlement. So something that could happen over time, but it's going to be difficult to immediately change that really quickly. I could see on day one, though, that the Biden administration would eliminate the state and local consent order, the order requiring that governors and local governments consent to refugees being resettled. So I think that could go away pretty quickly. I could also see the Biden administration, asking maybe a UNHCR to get more involved in Central America, to get more involved with the Central American Miners Program, just to be able to provide more ways for people in Central America to have the opportunity to get refugee status and be able to be resettled to the United States. Next slide, please. So we've also spent a lot of the last 4 years hearing about a wall, and I anticipate that we'll hear about a wall a lot less under a Biden administration. 654 miles already existed in January of 2017, And so, since the Trump administration, they've constructed about 260 miles of replacement fencing and about 5 miles of new border barriers. So I think the Biden administration, I think that they can halt wall construction, but it'll be a little bit complicated because if there are already contracts that they're committed to, they'll have to review those and figure out, can they get out of them, can they modify them, and so I think that there will be some, it will take some time to figure those things out. I do think that they can revoke the emergency authority that allowed them to take money from the Department of Defense and restore that funding to the Department of Defense, assuming that it hasn't all been spent. And you can see from this slide, just where the Trump administration got the $13.7 billion to, build barriers at the southern border. And you can see from here that really only $3.2 billion were actually appropriated through the regular appropriations process. So you may have seen some questions about, will the Biden administration tear down the wall? I know some people have been asking for that. And certainly they may have some authority to do it. Do I think that they will? I don't really think they will because, in 2006 there was the Secure Fence Act, and that was a bipartisan bill that authorized 700 miles of fence to be built just to gain operational control over the border. And so just given the amount of support there is for some barriers along the southern border, I just don't see them going in to tear down the wall. Will they build new wall? I think they won't unless they really think it's something that's necessary for border security. Legislatively, I think that there will continue to be some negotiations through the appropriations process about money, how much money to put towards barriers and things like that. But I think we won't hear that much about it. I think it'll just be part of the normal appropriations process, and they'll come to agreements, and we won't really hear a whole lot of disagreement about that. So these are only a few of the areas that have been changed under a Trump presidency, and we know that the Biden administration will have a lot to do on immigration, and so it remains to be seen, which things they are going to focus on first. I do think that DACA and TPS and refugees are things that they will do pretty early on. So I am very optimistic that a lot of these things can be changed through executive action. Ideally we would like more legislation. And so we'll just have to see, in January what happens with those Georgia races, and to see whether a Biden presidency, a Biden administration works differently with Republicans in the Senate. So hopefully it will be good, but it will definitely take some time. And I'm happy to answer any questions at the end.
Thanks so much. And there's a lot here, and I know we're all kind of wondering how this is going to work out. And so please, to all of you who are listening in, bear with us. I think we're all working to make these changes a reality. Our next speaker is Teresa Brown. She is at the Bipartisan Policy Center. She's going to talk a little bit, dig in a little bit about the election, and also just talk about kind of what's next as we look at kind of the next couple critical months. So, we've just heard about what's possible in terms of changing due to the change in the presidency, and now we're going to hear about what we can see in the short-term future, and also just do a little bit more of a deeper dive as it relates to the election itself.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you to USCCB for inviting me to speak here with Jacinta and Carlos. Thank you to you all. I am with the Bipartisan Policy Center, which is, as its name says, a bipartisan think tank in Washington, D.C. We work on a lot of different issues. I've been involved with immigration at the BPC since 2014. I've been involved with immigration as an issue for over 20 years, including some time at DHS and CBP under both the George W. Bush and Barack Obama administrations. I'm going to talk, as Ashley said, a little bit about how immigration was treated during the campaign, a little bit about what we know about the immigrant vote, and what that might mean for some of the policy changes that people are seeking. So we can go ahead to the next slide, if you please. And the next slide, please. So although immigration was a really key part of the 2016 presidential campaign, Trump made it really a centerpiece of his campaign. And it was a big issue in 2018 in the midterm elections as well. You may remember that just before the midterm elections in 2018, there was the issue of the caravans coming up from Central America, and President Trump made a big deal about those. Immigration was not as central a theme during the campaign in 2020. Some of that is due to the low number of migrants at the border during the 2020 campaign, but most of it had to do with the prevalence of COVID-19 and the economy on the minds of voters. So it wasn't highlighted significantly in the campaign. That being said, it did come up. It did come up finally in the last presidential debate, where, as you see from the story at U.S. News and World Report, Biden tried to hit Trump on the family separation and his asylum policies. Trump touted his border record on the wall. He tried to make the claim that it was the Obama-Biden administration that started the kids in cages, if you remember that. But the fact that it didn't come up until the very last debate tells you that even for reporters covering the story who try to tee up issues during the debates that tend to be on the mind of most voters, they didn't see it as a very big issue. Still, Trump did talk about immigration. As you can see, by mid-2019, he had talked about immigration in mostly negative terms for about 500 times at his rallies. Once he started his public rallies again after COVID, he did talk again about the border wall. Mostly he talked about immigrants in terms of potential to commit crimes in cities and things like that, which was consistent with a law and order message that he promoted on the campaign. Next slide, please. In spite of a lot of the negative rhetoric that came out of the Trump administration, interestingly, we saw during the period of the Trump administration, Americans' perceptions of the positive nature of immigration increased. For the first time since Gallup began asking this question about whether or not immigration should be increased, decreased, or stay the same, as of July 2020, the people who said that it should be increased were more than those who said it should be decreased, and very close to the amount who said it should be staying the same. And you can see that trend line. We have not seen that before since Gallup started asking this question in 1965. So it's important to understand that overall, Americans generally are favorable to immigration and toward immigrants. And so as an electoral issue, for some it's more important than for others, but overall, Americans are kind of in the same place when it comes to immigration. Next slide, please. As you can see here, when Pew Research Center asked in August of 2020 what were the top election issues for voters, the economy and healthcare were number one and number two by a very large margin. Immigration didn't come in until way down the list, with just over 50% of respondents registering immigration as very important to their vote in the 2020 presidential election. And this, more than anything else, is probably why we didn't hear the campaigns talking so much about immigration. They tend to try to tilt their messages to the issues that voters care about the most. And as you can see, immigration was just not top of mind. That is very different from the way these issues played out in the 2016 election. In 2016, immigration cracked the top 5 issues for voters, at times reaching number 1. By the 2018 midterms, immigration, again, partially because of what was happening at the border, was much higher at number 1 or number 2 for most voters. So it definitely dropped down significantly in importance by the time 2020 came around. Next slide, please. The other thing to bear in mind as immigration as a campaign issue is that it isn't necessarily an issue that drives voters to the polls. So on the left, you see a graph from the Democracy Fund voter study in 2018 that shows that pro-immigration people rate the issue as not very important to their voting preference. While those who are opposed to immigration tend to rate it much higher in terms of a voting priority. And so that enthusiasm gap plays out just about every election when parties of both sides try to make immigration an issue. On the right hand, you see again from the Pew Research Group in their survey in August, immigration is a low priority, as you see toward the bottom, but you also see that as an issue, it is much more of an important issue to Trump supporters than it was to Biden supporters. So Trump would continually talk about immigration to try to turn out his base, whereas Biden didn't really talk about it so much because for his voters, it wasn't as big an issue. Next slide, please. Now, this election saw the most number of immigrant voters that we have seen in elections to date. 1 in 10 eligible voters in 2020 were immigrants. Of course, naturalized citizens in order to be eligible to vote. But that's a record high. But most of the immigrants are not evenly spread out throughout the country, and so the immigrant vote is not what I think most people would consider a voting bloc. They don't necessarily vote all alike, and different parts of the immigrant populations in different areas can vote differently. And so that also reflects in how a lot of campaigns will deal with the immigrant issues. It really depends on how it's reflected in their local state or their states or jurisdictions. Next slide, please. Even for Latino voters, which is the population that most people will look to when they think about immigration, this year, economy and healthcare were the #1 issues according to surveys that had been put forward. And that's not unusual, and Carlos may have more to say about this, but in general, immigration is an important issue for many Latino voters, but it's rarely the top issue, just as the same for other populations and groups that we have seen. Next slide, please. Overall, as you can see, because immigration was not a completely central issue to the campaign, whether or not a Biden administration would see the results of this campaign as a mandate to do particular immigration actions, I think remain to be seen. Certainly, we know that for Democrats and for his Democratic base, immigration was a very key issue, and his platform talks about, and Jacinta talked about, a lot of what we expect for immigration issues in the first part of the Biden campaign. But it is true that we're looking at potentially divided government. Democrats lost seats, particularly in moderate districts in this election, to Republicans, so they have a smaller majority, and their remaining members who may find themselves concerned about being in a moderate district might be a bit more concerned about what positions to take going forward on immigration. Again, as we've said, overall, we don't exactly know yet who's going to be in control of the Senate, but in a closely divided Senate, again, neither party can afford to lose more than 1 or 2 votes on any given issue in order to pass legislation. And that usually means that there will be more efforts at bipartisanship to get things done. Whether immigration is going to be one of those issues, I think we have to see. There's a lot of talk about how Biden himself is somebody who wants to seek bipartisanship. We certainly heard that in the speeches he made last weekend. He has a long and friendly relationship with Mitch McConnell from his years in the Senate, more so than even President Barack Obama did. And that may come into play if Republicans can maintain control of the Senate and Mitch McConnell remains the majority leader. The question is going to be how much political capital, if you will, a Biden administration is going to want to put towards immigration early in his tenure, given where he's going to come into the country and the issues at play. Again, COVID and the economy are going to be #1 and #2 issues to be dealt with. Immigration will be there, but an administration coming in can only do so many things and do them very quickly, same with Congress. So we have to see what happens there. A couple other points I just want to make about executive action versus legislation. As we all know, major immigration changes can only have permanence if and when there is legislation passed and enacted into law. And while an executive branch, a president, can do an awful lot by executive order or policy memorandum or even regulations, those can all be overturned by a subsequent administration, whereas legislation, of course, remains until it is repealed or replaced by a new legislation. So whether or not President Biden uses some executive actions, for example, on DACA or TPS, can have an implication for the likelihood of legislation in Congress. For example, we saw that after President Trump terminated the DACA program, he left time period for Congress to try to make a legislative solution before the program was ultimately terminated. They were unsuccessful, and then the courts came in and essentially told the administration to continue the program. After that, we saw very little legislation or attempts at bipartisan legislation, or even from the White House attempts to actually get legislation done on DACA. Congress at that point felt like the courts had kind of saved them and they didn't have to deal with the issue. So one question is, if a Biden administration were to immediately restore the DACA program by an executive order, would Congress then feel the need to weigh in? So those are questions of consideration of strategy a new administration may have. My guess is that a Biden administration would probably try to do both, which obviously act on an executive action to restore some of these programs. Those are fairly big campaign promises, and he's going to have a lot of pressure from the Democratic Party to do that, as well as try to get legislation through. But that's going to require, as I said, some more of his own political capital and his own relationships in Congress probably to get that over the line. So I'll leave it there. I'll be happy to answer questions again at the end, and I will turn it back over to Ashley. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Teresa. Before I get to our last speaker, I want to note there's a number of great questions, and we are going to answer them. Hopefully we'll have time to answer them, and if we don't, we'll start to type in the questions, and I will follow up with you and, of course, connect you with some of the experts who've been on the call. And so I'm going to turn to our last speaker. We just heard from Teresa about a really great, I think, analysis of the election and how immigration played in, as well as thinking about what's next in the idea of administrative reform versus legislative reform and what's possible. Now we're going to turn to Carlos Guevara from Unidos, and he's going to talk a little bit about COVID-19, what we're seeing here, what possible action can happen, and he also may speak in further detail about the vote as well. As I mentioned, I know a lot of you are very familiar with Unidos. We have a lot of affiliate relationships in the diocese, and so very excited to have him on as well. We are going to take the time to listen to his presentation, and we are certainly going to answer the questions. Even if they're not answered immediately, we can type them in or follow up with you as usual. So thank you again, and I welcome Carlos.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Ashley, U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and to my esteemed panelists, Jacinta and Teresa. It's always a pleasure to be on with you. Again, thank you for the opportunity to be here. My name is Carlos Guevara. I'm the Associate Director of Immigration Policy at Unidos US, as you heard from Ashley. For those who are unfamiliar with Unidos US, we are the largest Latino civil rights advocacy organization in the country, and formerly known as the National Council of La Raza. One of the things that I'm proudest of the organization, and something that certainly drew me to it, was the robust affiliate network that's been alluded to of nearly 300 or so community-based organizations throughout the country. And I know for a fact, and can attest to the fact that we have worked very closely with the diocese or the Catholic Charities network across the country in many instances. I myself started as a legal practitioner at the Diocese of Grand Rapids and the Immigration Legal Services Program, and then subsequently with the Catholic Charities of Baltimore. So, very well the great work that many of you all are doing in our communities, especially in these trying times. Briefly, before joining Unidos US, I did spend some time, you heard about my practitioner days, but also in the Obama administration from 2014 to 2017, where I worked on immigration policy matters at the Department of Homeland Security. So I think if we can turn to the next slide, today I was asked to talk about a little bit about what's going on the coronavirus front, on the COVID-19 front, the impact on Latinos and immigrants. And I think it's particularly relevant, as you've heard from Teresa just a moment ago, that this was top of mind for all voters, and certainly consistently as we were polling the Latino community, eligible voters in the Latino community, the top issue that folks came back to us with as the issue that they were going to decide on in this election, followed by the economy and healthcare. Two important points that tend to be certainly the economy towards the top of Latino voters' minds in any election, but certainly this year made more acute by the dynamics and the experiences of the community with the COVID-19. So just before we get into some of the impacts on the community, just a couple of notes. Today, nearly 8 in 10 Latinos in the United States are American citizens. The ninth is a green card holder, And it's the 10th that's undocumented and a lot of times gets a lot of the attention in our immigration conversations. But even as we think about the fact that the overwhelming majority of Latinos in this country are citizens or legally present in the United States, immigration nonetheless packs a powerful punch for the community, with the majority of Latinos citing that they know someone who is undocumented. And for us, which has been a source of a lot of our work in the past couple of years, this centers around the nearly 6 million U.S. citizen kids who live with an undocumented loved one or someone who is on temporary status, like Jacinta mentioned, on TPS or DACA. So it's a very important issue for the community that not just spans to the immigrant themselves, but this multi-generational concern that spans issues and spans, like I mentioned, generations. So it's with that in mind that we enter this conversation with COVID-19, and certainly for that matter, immigration enforcement, immigration policy. It's this idea that of this multi-generational impact, the fact that while many folks are U.S. citizens, immigration still packs a powerful punch. So that note, I think, is very important. We talked about, for Latino voters, the pandemic, COVID-19, and the response, the first issue that they want to see a president address being at the top of the list. And then when we talk about, so those 2 points in the third, when we talk about solutions, it's our belief at Unidos, and I know many of our partners share this view as well, that if we are to have the robust recovery that we all want from this pandemic, we need to advance and need to get serious about advancing equitable solutions that includes all communities of colors. And that necessarily, from our point of view, means all communities regardless of their concerns around immigration status as well. And the title here of this slide here is a paper that we drafted, that I authored back in July, that kind of looks at the impact of the community and the time of coronavirus. And if we can go to the next slide, we'll start to talk about some of these issues, again, in the context of the intergenerational scope that I just laid out. So the first thing is the impact on Latino health. I think that's the first thing that comes to mind for folks. And, the case that we've made, certainly for an inclusive recovery, but it's also what's going on in the community in terms of disproportionate impact. So while Latinos make up about 18.5% or so of the population, as of October 26th, I'm a little dated, but as of October 26th, they made up about 28% of the coronavirus cases. And we know we've seen an uptick of those in the past couple of weeks, so I know those numbers probably have gone up. And by comparison, non-Hispanic whites make up about 55% of the U.S. population, but about 46% of the cases. But we submit that this is only part of the story. As we've kind of developed our analysis and more things have become clear, and what we understand is the virus tends to have an outsized impact on the elderly. When we start to look at the younger segments, and this is what this table here reflects, we see that the outsized impact is orders of magnitudes greater when we talk about the Latino community. So we see here the blue bar. I'll let folks revisit this at a later time, but the blue bar here represents population, and light blue represents the proportion of cases. And you see these across the younger segments, and Latinos certainly having an overrepresentation in those. So as we think about why, again, with the lens of the intergenerational impact on the community, the fact that immigration packs a powerful punch in the Latino community, we can't help but ignore the need to make the case for broader inclusive recovery for the community. The other piece that I will note before we move on is that, unfortunately, because of immigration dynamics, I think largely because of immigration dynamics, I'm sure there are others, we don't think we yet have a full picture of the impact. As we know, many folks, unfortunately, as a result of immigration policy, certainly the rhetoric of the past 4 years hasn't helped, have made folks fearful of actually coming forward and seeking the help that they need. So we suspect, as we get a clearer look at ethnicity data, which shockingly remains unknown in big numbers in states like Texas and others with Latino populations, that the magnitude of the harm or the impact and the health perspective on the community maybe actually higher. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So as we are dealing with the twin impacts of this crisis, one, the health, the second being, was alluded to earlier, the economic crisis, we know that many Latinos are, and this is what this chart represents, are stepping up in many important ways for the country in largely in many ways so-called essential jobs. These jobs in many instances or sectors having been designated by our very government, the Department of Homeland Security itself, in many instances as essential. In other words, folks who have no choice but to go forward, and in many instances, unfortunately, giving themselves risk of exposure to the virus and their families as well when they come home. We see here just farm to fork. Let's talk about some of the essential jobs that Latinos are involved with. You see that 54% of the agricultural workers in the country are Hispanic, about 29% of medical assistants, 15% of frontline protective workers, and so forth. So we argue that the community is stepping up in these very important times and very meaningful ways, again, in also putting themselves at risk of exposure. Our latest jobs report, we put out one of these every at the beginning of every month, shows that the Latino employment rate is 10.3%, an improvement to be sure from the beginning of the pandemic, but still among the highest rates of all groups in the country, even as Latinos make up about 17.6% of the entire workforce. So for us, the central argument that you'll hear today, you'll hear going forward, you'll hear in the next 100 days and the next year, is that we really cannot have the recovery we all want without a comprehensive health and economic response that addresses the resiliency of all communities. An important piece of that is how we think about protecting some of these essential workers. Again, not all of these are immigrants per se, but we've talked about the powerful punch immigration packs when it comes to the Latino community. So for us, this is an important piece of advocacy going forward. We can go to the next slide. So here briefly, just touch on a couple of the things that we are tracking. The U.S. Census has a tool, it's the effect of the Pulse Census tool that has information that they survey the community, all communities, frankly, about some key measures. I lifted up two here for your consideration. One is households with children in the U.S. that report not having enough to eat in the past 7 days. The orange line represents the Latino community compared to others. And on the right-hand side, considerations about health insurance, of which we know, unfortunately, well, I'm just not going to make a statement, but we know as a result of the way our healthcare system is structured, are largely tied to employment. So as jobs are lost or folks have to move to other types of jobs, we would expect that health insurance take up or access to health insurance would increase as well. So this I will also just plug before going to the next slide. We have a number of these kind of tools that you yourselves can play with. We just dropped this dashboard on our website called By the Numbers, Latinos in the Time of the Coronavirus. I'm happy to share on the back end. So you can see many of these measures, and includes a lot of things about education as well, housing and so forth, where, again, the case is clear to us, or the reason for why the case is clear to us is reflected in the data that we're seeing out of the community. You can go to the next slide, please. So briefly, what we've seen to date and where I think we continue to do some of our work is to ensure that we're building upon efforts so that we've seen in the Congress to make sure that we do have access to a more inclusive recovery. Unfortunately, some of the steps that have been enacted have fallen short, top of mind, in a place that I know many of us on this call have been looking at closely, is this idea of economic impact payments to folks in mixed status families, where, for example, in a family of four, 3 out of the 4 folks are U.S. citizens, but perhaps the fourth files their taxes with an ITIN number, tax identification number. And that family, under current recovery legislation, is categorically barred when they file joint taxes. So we have been advocating for, among that, the elimination of what we call simply a marriage penalty, but also more inclusion in the health response for folks and more access to state and local dollars to be able to support families in need. So I'm happy to answer any more questions about what that might look like, but the key point is that as we look forward to the response from the Biden administration on the relief side and a more kind of comprehensive recovery legislation, whether it's infrastructure or something along those lines, it's our firm belief that we need to look at a comprehensive inclusion of communities across not just some of these important supports, but as we talked about earlier in the case of essential workers, ensuring that they have the stability that they need to protect themselves and their families at a very minimum while we're in the middle of a pandemic. We can just go to, I believe that might be my last slide, but I did want to say briefly some notes on the Latino vote. I know that's a topic of conversation, and from where we sit, I think one of the things that has really inspired me, frankly, is that for the first time we have seen nearly 15 million Hispanic voters make their voices heard. This is record turnout, which for us, we are also a nonpartisan organization, is the goal, is ultimately promoting Latino representation, inclusion, and that ensuring that our voices are heard. And in fact, we'd argue that they were heard loud and clear across many key states, and many were involved in determining the outcomes in battleground states as well, including states like Pennsylvania that proved to be very, very decisive, where there's 300,000 Latino votes were cast. In addition, an important note, and I will also plug here a tool that we recently released with a number of organizations. We've now been doing this for several cycles, the 2020 American Election e-poll, which you can go in and toggle, has really good information about the Latino vote, the Black vote, the white vote, Asian American vote, across states. And one of the things that strikes me is about 7 out of 10 Latinos nationally voted for the President-elect Joe Biden, which is fairly consistent with the Latino turnout, positions, if you will, from the past. What that also means is that about 30%, or 3 out of 10, or so reliably and have reliably voted Republican. We know that the Latino vote is not monolithic, and that issues and candidates really matter, and ultimately that engagement with the community, as we've seen in places like Arizona, can pay big evidence. Arizona and Florida, I will add, can pay big dividends for those willing to make that investment. So let me pause there. I know we're up on time here. Thank you very much for the time, and happy to take any questions.
So thanks so much, Carlos. We are near the end of the time, and I did just want to follow up first off and thank our speakers for all they're doing, but there are a couple points I think we wanted to follow up on. First, for any Catholic Charities or diocesan who has resettled refugees in the past and is interested, because we are indeed going to see an increased number, I urge you to reach out to me, Ashley Feasley, or Tony Cube, and we will set you in contact with our USCCB Resettlement Director to begin those conversations. So please feel free. There was a question about advanced parole with DACA that I believe Jacinta was able to answer, but we do have a backgrounder on the JFI page regarding possible changes to DACA that we can send to you as a follow-up link. And I will also ask if any of our speakers want to include backgrounders, they will do so. We've heard quite a bit about kind of a takeaway from the election, both about immigration and then Latinos generally. I do urge you to go onto the website of UNIDOS and also the Bipartisan Policy Center to look at some of the data that's been included here. We will include as follow-up links some of the things that our speakers have talked about. I do want to go back to just the last slide that Carlos had up before we end our session here. Tony, if you could go back to the slide on the impact of the. So many of you have been very instrumental in working with us to help support Senator Rubio's effort to get stimulus payment for certain mixed status families. A number of you, including the Diocese of Baton Rouge and the Archdiocese of New Orleans, worked with me to help encourage Senator Cassidy for his initiative with Senator Rubio. I know we've had a number of conversations with Sister Patricia Pora, who reached out to Senator Collins. I just want to show here how important this next stretch is as we work for this eligibility for economic stimulus. You've heard from our partners about what needs to happen, and we will be very much pivoting towards ensuring that people are able to get some of that money that I know is so important for their daily livelihoods. And so I think it's a good snapshot for us to end on. Our work is always continuing. We will continue this conversation on our national call next week. Tony, our national call is on?
Our national call is on Tuesday. Tuesday coming up at 3 p.m. Eastern.
We will send out, there's the links here, but Tony's going to save all of the links. We're going to send them back to you. I'm very thankful for our speakers and their time today, and we will send whatever links and information that they want to share with us. Many of them have newsletters that I urge you to sign up for to kind of learn more, in addition to our Weekend Review newsletter. And we've got a lot of work to do, a lot of optimism, but a lot of great things. So thanks again, and let's keep moving. Siempre adelante. Thank you again to all of our speakers, and we will continue working.